Welcome to Foil Friday or Factor Friday. Today we're going to be practicing factoring to standard form. So the first part of your notes has this problem. So what we're going to be looking at is we're going to start foiling. So meaning I'm going to take this x and multiply it by x, which gives me x squared, just like what we've been kind of dealing with. Then I'm going to take that same x and still multiply it by this negative 11 to get negative 11x. Because remember, if I factor to one number, I have to factor to the other. Now I'm going to take this 22 and multiply it by this x. Because I need to make sure everything beautifully gets factored. And then negative times a negative gives me a positive 22. Oops. If I didn't know what 22 times 11 was, I can write it off to the side and see that it's going to give me 242. Perfect. Now I can combine my like terms, which is this negative 11x and this negative 22x. Since they're both negative, it's going to become more negative. Think of it as I owe you $11. And I take $22 more from you. I now owe you $33. And everything else can be moved down. So now what I have is my final standard form. So the y-intercept, where it hits the y-axis, meaning my x's need to be 0. So if I plug in 0 here for all of my x's, I can see that I get just 242. Because these cancel out and give me 0, and 0 squared is 0, so I get 242. So my y-intercept is 0, 242. Because if I plug in 0 to any of the x's, those will all cancel out. A great way to remember it is, this number that's not attached to an x is actually going to be my y-intercept, just like our b when we had y equals mx plus b. And in order to know its concavity, I can look at the first term here. If it's positive, it means it's concave up. If it's negative, it means it's going to concave down, meaning it's going to look like a sad face. So in this case, we have a concave up for this standard form. Now in order to figure out the x and y-intercept, well, we can look actually back at the factored form. So I can look back at my original factored form, this x minus 22 and this x minus 11. So in order to figure out what this x is for our x-intercept, what can I put in this place to cancel out this 22? Well, what I can put is positive 22. And here's why. It's positive. Because if I have a positive 22, 22 minus 22 gives me 0. So essentially what I'm doing is taking the opposite of whatever is next to the x in our parentheses and flipping the sign. So instead of a negative 22, I have a positive 22. So I have 22 in place of my x. So I have 22, comma 0. Remember, x-intercepts, the y is 0. Okay? Then my second one here, if I wanted to figure out what minus 11 is going to give me 0, all I need to do is flip the sign. So 11 minus 11 is going to give me 0. So a good way to remember x-intercepts when it's in factored form, take the sign in the parentheses, flip it, and take the number. Okay? So we'll practice some more. Let's move on to our second problem here. So we've got these problems. So now again, I'm just going to FOIL x squared And x times negative 103 is going to give me a negative 103x. 3 times x is going to give me a 3x. And 3 times 103 is actually going to give me 309, or negative 309, because a negative times a positive is negative. So if I combine these two x's together, these two middle terms, if I owe you $103 and I only give you $3, I still owe you $100. Sorry. I'm going to bring everything else down to make sure it's all nice and pretty and even in standard form. So what's my y-intercept, you ask? Well, let's look at our constant or term that doesn't have an x, which is negative 103. So we're going to have 0, negative 103 for our y-intercept. Our x-intercept, remember, we're going to take the opposite sign of what's in our parentheses before in factored form. So instead of a positive 3, I'm going to have a negative 3, comma 0. And remember, x-intercepts, the y is always 0. Y-intercepts, the x is always 0, because it has to hit the y-axis or x-axis. So now I take the opposite of this negative 103, which is a positive 103. In order to know if it concaves up or down, I'm going to look at my x squared term. Since it's positive, it's going to concave up. Now let's try our following next one. Starting to get the hang of it, right? Okay, so now I actually have negative 2x times an x, which is fine, which is just going to give me negative 2x squared. So it's just changing the sign in front of this x squared. Now I'm going to take negative 2x and multiply it by a 4. Well, negative times a positive is a negative. So negative 2 times 4 gives me negative 8, and I still need to bring the x with it. Now I have 15 times x, which is just going to be a positive 15x. And last but not least, now I have 15 times 4. So if I didn't know what that was, I can write it off the side, and it's going to be 60. Cool. Now I'm going to combine my two like terms, which are my middle terms. Usually you'll see that you combine the x's together. So I have negative 8x plus 15x. Well, 8 to 10, so if I owe you $15, or sorry, I have $15 and you take 8 away from me, I'm going to have how much money left? 7. Yep. And bring everything else down with it. And there's my factored form. Or sorry, my standard form. Now my y-intercept? 0, 60. Because, remember, the number without the x in standard form is going to tell me my y-intercept. I can also know that it's concave down because it's negative, a negative number. If it was a positive 2, it would concave up. But in this case, it concaves down. And in order to figure out my x-intercepts, well, since this is a negative 2x plus 15, we're going to set that equal to 0. And it's just the same thing as setting the other ones, x plus 22, to equal to 0. But in this case, I have to actually do a step. So in order to get x by itself, I have to subtract 15. 0 minus 15 is going to give me a negative 15. So the reason I'm doing this math is because I want to know what times this negative 2 is going to get me to plus 15 to get me to 0. So the last step I need to do is divide by negative 2. Two negatives equal positive. I have positive 15 over 2, or 7.5. So 7.5 times negative 2 will get me a negative 15 plus 15 to get me a 0. So I have 7.5 comma 0. And for the second term, this is easy to see since there's no number attached to it. The opposite of a positive 4 is a negative 4. And I can show you on Desmos. What's super great about Desmos is that I can actually enter in our standard form or even our factored form and get the parabola. So to compare, I wrote the equation in here, and I'll just move it over here so we can compare our x-intercepts. If you click here, here's our x-intercept where it hits the x-axis. I have a negative 4, so that checks out. And then I have, yep, a positive 7.5 on my other x side, on the other side of my parabola. And if I really wanted to know, all the way up here, my y-intercept is 60, and it concaves down. So I know I'm doing it right. So let's move on to our next few down here. Alright, so let's do it again. Now we're going to do negative x times negative x. Two negatives give me a positive, so I just have regular x squared. Then I have negative x times positive 13. A negative and a positive give me a negative, and I get 13x. Then I'm going to take this 7, since I distributed all to the second one here from the first term. I'm going to take 7 and multiply it by a negative x. Negative times positive is a negative. I'm going to get negative 7x. And our very last term here is 7 times 13. If you didn't know, you can write it off to the side, which is 81, because two positives make a positive. Now I'm going to combine my negative 13x and my negative 7x, and that's going to give me what? Let's see. 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. I'm going to get negative 20 because they're both negatives and it's becoming more negative. And bring all my other terms down that I can't combine together to get my final standard form. So now I have my y-intercept, which is 0, 81, because remember it's the last term, or our b. This is my y-intercept, not attached to an x. I know it's concave up because it's positive. And now I can look here. So I have a negative 7 plus 7. Now it makes sense. I could put a negative 7 there, right? Well, if I put a negative 7 there, a negative times a negative is a positive, so I'd have 7 plus 7, which would be 14, which is not equal to 0. So in this case, if there's a negative sign in front of the x, I'm going to put the exact same number. So I actually have 7 for my answer here. That's my y-intercept. I'll show you in a second what it looks like on the graph. Same thing with this. I have 13. The reason why is because of the negative in front of the x. So now that I've graphed it, I can see it's concave up. My y-intercept is 81. Oops. Here we go. My x-intercepts are 7 and 13. Because the negative in front of the x makes it turn negative. Okay, so we do have one more video for you. Please watch the second video for the last few notes.